I lived in the East Allen home in Winooski. And when I first got out of prison, so I stepped out of a facility for the last time, August 26th of 2016. So not that long ago. And it was a wonderful experience living at Dismas House. Most especially the support and relationship I built with the assistant director, Sue Drillette, still remains a very special relationship to me. But it was the sense of family that Dismas House provided me. It was the sense of belonging, connection, and community that really helped to lay the foundation to where I am today. That was when folks say to me, like, how'd you do it? How'd you like come out of jail and end up where you are now? And I always talk about that experience as one of the key points. So this is a full circle moment for me to be able to come back and give back to Dismas House and all of the folks that allowed me to have that opportunity. So I thank you for that. So welcome. So today's topic is women's experience in incarceration and in the state of Vermont. A little background on me. So you kind of just heard my professional resume, but very importantly is the fact that I am a directly impacted woman. So my pronouns are she, her. I identify as female. And I am formerly incarcerated in the state of Vermont. My felonies are fraud-based. So I have 2 felony convictions for fraud. I have several misdemeanor convictions for other crimes, things like retail theft, possession of stolen property, unlawful trespass, several other ones. I like to be very honest about my background. I was someone who struggled with significant trauma. I am also a survivor of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual violence. And I am a person who is in recovery for substance use disorder. So I was a IV heroin and cocaine user. And that's really how my crimes came to be. So I think it's really important to understand that I not only have a very personal and lived experience view on this issue, but then I also paired that with education, professional development, and really went to work. Folks ask me a lot why I'm an abolitionist. As you heard, WJFI is an organization I founded and I'm the current executive director of. And they say, why abolition? You want to unlock the doors like of the prison and let those scary people like move next to me and my children? That's terrifying. But abolition is actually the idea that we have invested so much in our communities, in our responses to harm, in addressing the underlying reasons why folks become entangled in the legal system in the first place, that prison is no longer a necessity. That's really what abolition is about. It's about how do we maintain and create safe and thriving communities, right? If prison was an effective tool, we wouldn't have prison in 2022, right? Like if it was an effective deterrent or effective rehabilitation measure, there would be less people incarcerated now, or we would have less prisons now than maybe 30 or 50 years ago. That's clearly not the case. They asked me a lot of folks ask me the difference between abolition and criminal justice reform. And I always try to explain to people, reform is the idea that our system is broken, that it's inhumane, that if we just take these further measures, right, we can fix it, we can create a better system. But the reality is the system is not broken. Our correctional and legal systems do exactly what they were designed to do, to segregate people, to dehumanize people, to control and punish. And they do it very well. So abolition is the idea that we actually need to completely stop and do something very different, right? We need to build accountability. Do you know anybody that's been to prison? Was anybody in there guilty? We're all going to laugh and be like, no, everybody was innocent. They didn't do what they were accused of, right? The idea is that we want to hold people accountable. We actually want those people to feel that accountability, right? We actually want people to be accountable. And then we want folks to address the harm, right? Crime is a scary word for harm, right? We want folks to address harm, and then we want to see that change behavior. How do we know they're going to go back to community or not commit that harm again? And so that's what abolition is about, is how do we create that accountability and assist that person in the change behavior part and in the reparation of that harm. So that's really the biggest differences. Getting to the topic of women and why I kind of give that explanation and segue is because the trajectory for female identified folks, I use the word women all inclusively, is very different than our male counterparts. And as you heard Jeff kind of explain in the beginning, like, the stories are very different. They're very unique. There are several different points in history where, mass incarceration really starts to have, kind of uptick. We have the kind of legal battles that happen, the tough on crime policies, through the Nixon, Reagan eras. We have in 94, the crime bill that Clinton put in. We have the war on drugs, some of these measures that were meant to increase public safety and address social justice issues, health issues, drug use, drug sales, all of those pieces. What started to happen is, as prison population numbers started to grow, and that was mostly and very much Black and brown men, and then subsequently kind of everybody else, is that women's populations began to rise. So through the war on drugs, women were now receiving convictions for things like conspiracy. So let me give you an example: conspiracy to distribute drugs. Let's say a woman had a partner, a boyfriend, maybe husband, and they were selling drugs. There was an instant assumption that you must have known about it, you must have participated in it, even if there's absolutely no evidence. Women were being charged with this kind of conspiracy word that was a blanket charge and receiving extremely long sentences. We saw as the opiate epidemic really grew through the 2000s, many people were receiving prescriptions, not realizing at the time, right, that addiction was going to be an outcome for them. And we saw many women starting to be incarcerated over crimes related to that, whether it was, retail theft, whether it was, cashing bad checks, a lot of these crimes related to the opiate epidemic. About and around the same time, around 2010, give or take, there started to be these new conversations kind of right before that time and right after, around things like restorative justice. All of a sudden, folks were realizing, oh my gosh, our prison populations have exploded. It's ballooning. It's out of control. Vermont was in the same conversation. It was, around 2009 that they participated in Justice Reinvestment 1, which was looking at the Vermont correction system, figuring out how to decarcerate, and then reinvesting that money into measures. And that's when you saw the creation of things like court diversion, rapid arraignment programs, treatment courts started to be talked about. It was an effort to try to address this uncontrollable and ballooning incarcerative population in the state. And they were able to do that. They decarcerated our state by about 1,000 people. So that was around the time that these conversations, the CJCs were created out of that measure, the community justice centers. So there was a lot of work done both in Vermont and nationally to really start addressing this. But there was one population that was left out of that conversation, and that was the women's population. Most of the programs and efforts were really on the male populations. In Vermont, the male population had much larger numbers than the female population. And while that's still true, women were being completely left out of the conversation. And this was happening nationally in the United States. So around that same time, women in federal prisons and in state prisons began organizing themselves, began creating groups to advocate for policy changes, to advocate for women, and really starting to say, hey, wait a minute, there's so many different reasons that we're experiencing incarceration. None of the reasons we're here are being talked about. We're not being talked about. Our children aren't being talked about, right? So it was really around that time that women themselves started fighting for a seat at the table, a seat in the conversation. To fast forward, thinking about right now, there are about 85 women in the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility as of the head count today. We know that upwards of 90% of the people in CRCF right now have experienced significant trauma, whether that's child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, sexual violence, poverty, homelessness, all of the pieces. That's a staggering number when you have an entire facility who a huge portion of their story, of their pathway to criminal justice involvement is based out of trauma. We also know that almost the same number are our moms, our parents. Vermont experiences 6,000 children, 6,000 children a year. And that's just an estimation. That's a small estimation. Deal with parental incarceration in the state of Vermont. That's the same number of babies approximately that are born here every year. We know that the majority of primary caregivers to those children are our mothers. We know that specific to women in incarceration, not only trauma, but the ability for women to get and access employment. I'm sure many people are familiar with conversations around wage equity, what women make versus what men make, the responsibility of childcare, you know, for our children, where we tend to be the primary caregivers, even if we have a male partner. We're the ones that stay home from work more often. And these are just kind of statistics. I want to note there are some wonderful men that stay home with their kids when they're sick, just to throw that out there, because my husband may watch this later. But the reality is that the both barriers, challenges, and responses that women receive are very different. We are also held to a different standard. It's gotten better, but the reality is, oh my God, you're a mom and you were out there doing drugs. You're the worst of the worst. Wait, you're a woman and you were out there doing sex work, prostitution. You are morally corrupt. Women are held to a different standard than men. That's the reality. And it's both based out of religion to the points of Christianity and Catholicism, which I was raised in. I was raised Catholic. And there is an expectation on how I conduct myself in the world. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. There's many good parts of that, right? Like I should be a good person and be right with the community. But there's also this idea that we are mothers and we are supposed to be ladylike and we are supposed to be these caregivers and this kind of matriarch figures in our communities and our families. And so when women began to commit crime or be incarcerated for their crimes, rather, there was almost a more punitive point when it came to sentencing, when it came to responding to that, because we're women, because we should know better. We should be ladylike, right? How dare you do that to your children? So you can see how our sentences then, so if a man was charged with the same thing I was getting a longer sentence, for example. On top of that, there is also the experience that women face during incarceration. Over the last few years, Vermont has been plagued with accusations and accounts of sexual assault in our correctional facility against incarcerated women, of retaliation against women who speak out about that abuse, physical assaults, misconduct. It's been difficult. Historically, women are the first population in correctional systems to be sexually assaulted, to be abused, to be the victims of misconduct. Second to that is transgendered folks. So, or they're actually now in 2022, the last study is they're about even. That's terrifying. Men are much, it happens to men. I want to note that those types of abuse and assaults happen to men, but at a much less rate, or maybe just less reported. Male trauma can be a different topic for a different day. So for women, it's also the we serve our time, and then the barriers to coming back to community are very different. Getting a job is very different for women, and what jobs we tend to be able to get. If you have a felony, regardless of your gender, it's already problematic. But if you're a female who then has a felony, women tend to be applying for or be qualified for less labor intensive jobs, where our male counterparts maybe go into automotive or construction or more labor and apprenticeships and electrical types of work, those fields, which are more accepting to give you a second chance. They're much more welcoming to give you another chance. Women, it tends to be kind of like retail, kitchen work, housekeeping, some of those pieces. But on top of that, we're usually in a space to have to reconnect with our children. So another barrier is how to then rebuild our relationships with our children, with our families, and the burdens that come along with that. We are responsible to then address our children's trauma as well as our own. The state of Vermont has a very restrictive form of community supervision, which is very different to other states. We're only the second state in the nation that has this type of supervision, which is called furlough. Those of us in the system know it as FSU. And essentially what it is you are released from the facility once you have completed your minimum sentence, but you're still technically considered incarcerated, even though you're in the community. And so this type of supervision does things like, let's take living at the Dismiss House in my experience. So I got out and I was on furlough and I came to Dismiss House, and we agreed to be there for house dinner. We agreed to be there for house meeting. We agreed to respect the rules. Correction says you cannot work a third shift job until you make parole. So we need to work during business hours during the day. You also have a curfew that says you cannot leave Dismiss House. For me, it was after 9 p.m. at night, and I couldn't leave until 7 a.m. the following morning. But then I had no car. So then I needed to use the bus, public transportation. I also, in order to get out, had to participate in an intensive outpatient counseling program because I'm an addict. So they wanted me to get treatment for my addiction. And then in order to see my children, DCF wanted me to do 3 visits a week at their office in Williston from 10 to 12. When am I getting a job? How am I paying rent? Dismiss House has the most affordable rent ever in the state in any transitional program I have ever seen, which is amazing. But it was still, how do I get to all those places? How do I actually work? And how do I do all of the requirements that were put on me? On top of the fact that I was a victim of domestic violence and my first husband was living 3 miles from me. How do I protect myself? Am I safe standing outside on the side of the road to wait for the bus? So when women are incarcerated, we are no longer survivors, we are no longer victims. So the second you become a felon, the second you become incarcerated, anything that happened to you before that no longer matters. I am both. I am all of the things. I am a mom, and I'm also somebody that had 3 of my biological children adopted. I am somebody who committed a crime, and I am also a victim of crime. But that doesn't actually exist, which creates a huge vacuum in the services that are offered to women or in the services that we feel comfortable trying to access. There are also things like women who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated tend to be screened out of services versus screened in. So for example, sometimes in domestic violence situations, sometimes in homelessness situations where you're working with local shelters or you're working with, local agencies, and they ask you questions to screen for services. Women in this state are screened out of those services. Or if you're on any type of supervision, oh, you can't live in our shelter, or you can't live in that hotel. So then our options for safety or for getting our basic needs met are very different. Our propensity for violence is very different. Most women in Vermont and in this country who commit violent crime are actually under a category called survived and punished, meaning that we attempted to defend ourselves from an attacker and we injured them and or even killed them. Meaning that we were in a situation where we were told, if you do not go and steal those things from that store, I'm going to assault you. That is very different than our male counterparts. So there's many points, some of which I covered and several more. But what I think is important to know is there has been a shift. In the last 2 years, we have seen a shift in the conversations around women's incarceration. In Vermont in particular, with the focus on CRCF, with that facility and the misconduct, there was internal investigations. There was many organizations across the state attempting to respond, wanting to get involved. And so we've seen a change. I often have folks come to me and say, well, what about the men though? Because now all the attention is on women, right? And what about the men? Every measure that would benefit women, that would intervene in the incarceration of women, that would address a particular issue, automatically positively affects our male counterparts. Every measure that we're trying to change or that needs to be changed just instantly positively affects the men, and that's always the answer. It's about 12:30. Bartlett, should we open it up for questions and conversation?
I think that would be terrific. That's a great idea. And I know that our chat's currently disabled. So I think Jim, the chat is back up. So again, everybody, the ground rules for question and answer are be respectful. Either raise your hand. I'm going to have to change my screen view so I can see raised hands, or type your question into the chat. And while we wait for folks to get onto the chat, I'll just start off with a first question. I'm really interested in your discussion about the impact of prison on families and the statistic of 6,000 children being having a parent incarcerated in the state of Vermont. I'm sort of find that quite stunning. What kind of support do you feel would be the best to offer to families who are currently in that situation, and how do we organize in our community to help provide it?
Absolutely, great question. I also want to just say to the questions in general that I welcome questions. Sometimes people are hesitant because they're like, oh, that's very personal. It's about her personal experience, or oh, this might not come across the right way. I just want to encourage our audience to ask me anything that you would like. I welcome any and all questions. To the question of children and families, there's actually a lot of work being done. So there's actually a bill right now going to House Judiciary called the Primary Caretaker Bill. And this is one measure that says if you are a primary caretaker, doesn't specify mom, dad, or in between, to a minor child, and you are facing incarceration, that you should be sentenced to alternatives whenever and just whenever possible. If the harm, violation of law, is so egregious that incarceration is a must under the eyes of the law. It then goes on to say where that person is incarcerated, as we know that Vermont currently has a private prison contract in Mississippi, how long the term of that incarceration is, what are the terms of the supervision. And this is solely to think about the children, right? When you incarcerate a parent, you incarcerate that child. Where do they have to go? Kids spend hours in a car to drive to see their dad or mom, or if they're out of state, they don't see them, right? What are the conditions of the visits? Mothers have the kids apart program, the dads don't. So it's really thinking about that children should have a right to be thought about in decisions about their parents and their sentence. We should be thinking about kids. If we want to interrupt generational trauma, if we already know that statistically children who experience parental incarceration, that's one of the ACEs, one of the adverse childhood effects. We know that it affects children's mental health. We know that it affects their experience in school. It affects their medical health. Why would we not want to interrupt that in a positive way, if at all possible? Other things are getting involved. Can children get to visits? Donating gas cards to the programs that support like Lund, for example. They have the Kids Apart program. at CRCF. And so they give gas cards to families to try to help so that kids and moms can stay connected. They need volunteers to help with the visits because they try to make this a very positive experience. So there's not a lot of correctional staff involved to try to make sure the kids don't, feel safe and they're not seeing a bunch of guards. And so people can volunteer to help with that. So there's several and many different ways to get involved. It's also how you talk about it. If you're an educator, if you work in a pediatrician's office, if you do anything with children, just like we have explicit and implicit bias around race, around gender, around sexuality, we also have it about felons, criminals, those people, right? So it's really starting to think about how you talk about it, how your friends are talking about it, what language are you using? Kids don't always come to school and say, oh yeah, my dad's locked up in Newport, or oh yep, my mom's in CRCF. But if they hear teachers watching the news on their lunch break and the comments that are made, right? So it's really, even just small steps like that, thinking about how do we even start changing those small pieces of how we even think about this and talk about this with and in front of kids and even in ourselves.
It seems to me like ourselves is the place where we need to start on that one, right? I have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna just kind of go through them. Maggie Lane, I'm sorry, wanted to know whether there's something called working fields and whether there's a female experience with that. And she goes on to mention educational opportunities for women in lieu of job requirements as a way to increase future earning capability.
Yeah. So I've heard of working fields. I don't currently have my own experience with them. I think that they really attempt to support people through employment in a different way, really taking into consideration people are struggling with trauma, or people are struggling with criminal backgrounds, they are struggling with substance use. And so I think that they're an organization who's attempting to try to build a bridge, right, between kind of going to work, or why'd you miss work, or what's your barrier to getting to work, what happened over the weekend, or what's going on for you, to try to really both help employees and employers navigate, those issues. Education in lieu of would be a wonderful idea if that was a consideration. I think that the interesting thing about education is, as we know, right, given our workforce and the pandemic, we know that education or college degrees, right, don't always equal gainful employment. And education is wonderful, but it doesn't matter how many master's, PhDs, bachelor's degrees I have after my name, if it still says felony or misdemeanor, that's still really a barrier. There are still employers where I could literally have an MD after my name, PhD, all the letters, and I would still be denied. I'm considered a high-risk employee, and Big Lots will not hire me, but I am an executive director of a nonprofit.
Right, as well as a respected member of a lot of these legislatively convened commissions here in Vermont, right?
Yeah.
Ivy Schweitzer asked a really interesting question. She said she wanted to hear more about your vision of abolition in Vermont, and specifically what needs to be changed right now. What can we on the outside do?
Absolutely. So right now, Vermont is in conversation about new prison construction. So right now, I actually testified yesterday to this conversation. They're in the beginning phases of a 10-year plan to replace not only the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, but other facilities in our state. Since that, I've done this work legislatively and in the community for years now, and my question has always been, why are we not looking at what else is possible? Why are we not looking at what alternatives are there? What does Vermont not have anything of? Do you know that Vermont has no long-term treatment for anything? Not mental health, not substance use, nothing. Look at housing, right? Vermont has no affordable housing for anybody. It doesn't matter if you get a felony or not. That's just everybody. And so the reality is my ask and my viewpoint has been, first of all, before we commit tens of millions of dollars of your guys' Vermont taxpayer money to solely new prison construction, can we at least have one conversation about what else could be possible? What else could be a solution? How else could we address the problem? I mean, if anywhere could do it, it's Vermont, right? We believe in community. We believe in knocking on our neighbor's door to see if they're okay. We believe in our small towns. Vermont has some values, and we protect those very strongly. That's something that most Vermonters are very proud of. So why are we not applying those values in-house to our own people, to our own towns, to our own issues? So, I mean, if you think about that, former Commissioner Baker, before he left over the summer, said, I've got maybe 5 or 10 women that actually need a jail. The rest could be in a reentry situation. So then why are we looking at building an entire new jail with our money? We could do something different. It is proven now. There's been enough academia, enough data, enough statistics to show that prison in and of itself does not make you any safer. You are not any safer because I went to prison. If anything, I was worse when I got out. You're not mandated to do treatment. You can sit there and max out your sentence and do absolutely nothing. I could have sat there on my bunk and played cards the entire time. I would much rather see someone get the help and assistance they need to deal with the underlying reasons of why that happened in the first place. Anybody on this call that's a felon and has been to jail, anybody ever ask you what you needed? What would have helped you? No, that's the reality. Why are we not focusing on what the real problem is?
Thank you. That was a packed answer. I think Izzy Katolowitz via Jim Curran has asked, what are the ways that DV and SV crisis centers can better support survivors who have experienced incarceration? And I wish I knew what DV and SV stands for, but hopefully you do.
Domestic violence and sexual violence.
Thank you.
That's the DVSV. It's also called IPV, which is intimate partner violence.
Thank you.
So the way that our local, so we have many community providers for domestic and sexual violence in the state of Vermont and across our state and all the different counties. And one thing I've seen is there are some screening tools that are used for all of their clients. And one concern I have is, so I'll give an example without using names. So I was supporting a woman who was coming out of facility and coming back to the community. And we were very concerned for her safety. Although she had been incarcerated for about 1.5 years, we were approaching the 2-year mark of her incarceration. Her partner, who had been very abusive, there was significant violence, had written her letters alluding to potential violence when she was out, had made comments on phone calls, had sent messages, through other people or other, phone calls she was making, they would be like, oh, so-and-so called. Do you know what he said? So there was a lot of information, things on Facebook, from this person's account, that her providers were very scared. But when we went to the local agency, it was sort of like, well, she's been incarcerated for 2 years. She's not in imminent danger. So there is this old standard for DV and SV folks, and it's a federal standard in some ways as well, although there's some interpretation that can happen around this imminent danger standard. Standards are changing at the federal level, at state levels. The old standards for DV and SV responses are outdated and ineffective. There's people working right now, actually somebody on this call, Lisa Ryan, is heading up a project to think about different ways, the need for changing how we respond to domestic violence. And that's not just a Vermont thing, that's a national thing. So really thinking, that's what I meant when I was talking about screening out, right? Incarceration is actually just a pause button. it doesn't stop anything. It doesn't actually, it's the same thing for addiction. People get out, use the next day, and it's like they never were in jail. That's why so many people overdose. And we see that with violence as well. We see that with DV and SV as well. Even if the woman was incarcerated for a year, 2 years, 6 months, and they get out, sometimes they're in even more danger because they can't get the services. They can't access the services. So then maybe they go back to that relationship, or they go back to living in a situation that is unsafe because of things like that imminent danger standard.
Thank you. We have a question from Rita. And for everybody on the call, this is Rita McCaffrey, who is the founder of Dismiss of Vermont. And she says, thank you, first off, for your witness to women's incarceration experience in Vermont. And then she goes on to ask, how would you deal with women with children who commit felonies? And
well, so I guess, so my question is, like, is the question about like if they were present for your crime, or just if you committed a crime but you have children at home, but they weren't present or involved in it? I just want that clarification, Rita. So
why don't you answer it each way?
Each way? Okay.
Yeah, each way.
So let's start with let's say your kids are present, or we're in the home during the commission of crime. Let's say you were accused of selling drugs, and your kids are living in the home. There are instant protections that happen for children where we don't actually have to incarcerate that parent. So for example, the child welfare system, DCF, gets involved. There are you can't contact your victim clauses for conditions of release and conditions of supervision. So people always ask me like, oh, like if we pass that primary caretaker bill you were just talking about, which is H399, they say like, but what if the crime was against the child even? But there's instant protections. Our law already comes in and says you can't contact your victim, you can't be anywhere near your victim. Children especially, get further protections through the child welfare system as well. So it has no negative impact on children. Even if children are home, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I justified my drug use because I did it in the bathroom and my kids were playing in their room, right? I had the bathroom door shut, they didn't see anything. So it wasn't that bad. Of course, I had no business having my children while I was using drugs in the bathroom. DCF had every right to take my children from me. They were 100% correct. But the reality is what happens after that, right? A relationship between a child and their mom and their dad will always be the most important relationship in a child's life. It with the one exception, if that parent is being physically abusive to that child, abusive and neglectful. Other than that, we should always figure out a way to safely maintain those relationships. If you have a parent who is using drugs, who is committing crime, they're broken. They're a broken parent, right? Like this is they're struggling. They got trauma, they got issues, they got substance use, right? We're struggling here. Doesn't it make sense to provide that parent with wrap services just like we do for kids, right? If we have a child, we got a middle schooler, he's in 8th grade, he's acting out, he's throwing chairs at the teacher, right? Spray paints the school, gets a juvenile probation officer, we're gonna wrap that kid in services, right? We're gonna be like, we're gonna throw everything at him because he is like redeemable, he's a kid, he's resilient, and we're gonna wrap him with love and support because we know that he is worthy of it because like he's a kid and we can fix him, right? I think everybody would agree with that. That's how we view children for the most part in Vermont. So why don't we view their parents like that? So because I'm 21 or I'm 32, I'm no longer worthy of those things. What if I never had those things? And that's why I'm doing these things, or that's why I'm experiencing these things. So the reality is that anytime there's a child involved who has a parent that commits crime, we should be wrapping that family in services. Because even for my children who were adopted, I have a close relationship with them. They went to family members, praise the Lord. who, for no other reason than they love me, gave me a chance to be in their life. I don't regret that decision. I don't at all. I had no business having them at the time. I could not give them what I wanted to. And because I was their mother and loved them, like I said, yes, here, adopt them. And they were wonderful and did, because my children are not my possession to drag through whatever crap I'm going through. At the same time, I was a great mom when I was clean and sober. I was a great mom. I'm a great mom now because I got the help I needed, because this time around, I got the right mix for me. What made me who I am right now, what made me successful, what helped me stay clean and sober now, what helped me address my trauma, what helped me get out of poverty isn't the same thing that's going to work for Jeff or Jim or Mary or Holly or anybody else. We need to stop cookie cuttering services as well. I needed a really good individual therapist. Don't assign me to ILP. I don't need a PO telling me, no, a one-on-one counselor doesn't count. You have to go to IOP. 12-step programs do not work for everybody. They are wonderful. I'm a certified recovery coach, have been for a decade. That was just my Facebook memory the other day. 12-step programs do not work for everybody. Stop mandating people to them. Okay, let's figure out what actually works for people. And when we're talking about children, we have the right attitude. We should throw everything we got at kids. But PS, kids need their parents. So why don't we throw everything at them too? Oh,
I'm on mute.
I was just gonna say, hey, I can hear you.
No, thank you so much for that answer, Ashley. That was, I think you connected with everyone's heart on the Zoom call with that. I have a couple more questions. We're gonna run out of time soon, but we've got 10 more minutes. Paul Mangiello, or Wendy and Paul Mangiello ask everyone, has Vermont banned the box? I'm assuming that means solitary, but I don't know.
No, ban the box is a measure to keep employers from asking if you've been convicted of a crime, of a felony or misdemeanor on an application.
Got it.
So ban the box is actually just kind of the first step. So employers in Vermont can no longer, like if you get an application, they cannot ask that. However, the second you step in there for an interview, they can ask you that. And as a felon in the state of Vermont, you have to disclose.
Is there any possibility of expunging a felony conviction in Vermont, or does it depend whether it's Vermont or federal, or how does that deal?
So it does depend. Expungement is different if you have a federal charge or a state of Vermont charge. Vermont every year continues to expand our expungement laws. There are expungement clinics all over the state. There has been immense work done to continue to increase the list of expungible offenses. So yes, that is a possibility. They even changed the monetary requirement. You used to have to like pay per what we call docket or charge. Your charge has like a court number associated with it. And they've removed fees, so it's more accessible and equitable for everyone. But even if you have there are some charges that are not expungible. So any of what Vermont refers to as like the Big 12, so that's sex-based offenses, severe violence-based offenses, stalking offenses, there's kind of the Big 12. Most things in Vermont actually can be expunged. There are some parameters around that, and you can't owe any restitution still. But there are definitely some that can't. And expungement is not a complete removal. So if you go to work in childcare, for example, or you go to work with vulnerable adults, or you want to be a social worker for DCF, there's a level of background check that they will still show up, but they don't for most. So it's helpful for most jobs, but it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Caroline Olson wants to know if you have thoughts on the current push in Vermont for scattered site apartments. Would you like to see more congregate housing options for Vermont women?
Oh, this is the last year when the Department of Corrections changed their grant funding to housing providers for transitional living. that was a point of contention when they announced it to the legislature. They had concerns moving from the old model to the new. I think there should be both. The women have lost so many transitional housing beds across the state over the last 3 years that it's terrifying. They have almost nothing. The scattered site model, I have yet to see the fruition of these new apartments, new spaces, because PS, there's nothing for anyone. So you can't do a scattered site model if there's literally no apartments for anyone. My husband is a commercial contractor in Chittenden County. He cannot build them fast enough. Can't build them fast enough. They're full like that. Not to mention prices are skyrocketing because of COVID. Building materials are more, therefore rents have to be more. Vermont has one of the highest gaps between what people are making for wages and what it costs to live here in the country. So thinking about coming out of incarceration in this scattered site model, I benefited so much from living at a dismiss house. It's where I met some of the people who are nearest and dearest to my heart still today. There is nothing that replaces sitting at that table and eating dinner when you have been incarcerated for the last 2 years or 5 years.
Yeah.
We might bitch and complain, excuse my language, about, having to clean up after dinner, right? And do all those dishes and do our chores and some of the rules. And, we might fight amongst ourselves because this one doesn't do his chores when, he's supposed to. And we got to hash that all out at house meeting. But the reality is like, you also know that's your family, right? It's kind of like fighting with your brothers and sisters to some degree, because you have a shared experience. I get very concerned about the idea of somebody coming out of incarceration, especially a lengthy one, who most of us have issues with our families, right? Because we've been using drugs or we've been in jail and we have some broken relationships and connections. Addiction, the opposite of addiction is not actually sobriety, it's connection. Recovery is about connection, not just about not using drugs.
Yeah, it's I'm on mute again. No, I'm not.
No,
I was going to say it's a little more complicated than just say no, right?
It's much more complicated than just say no.
We have time for one final question, and Wenda asked, can you touch upon the experiences of women of color and how they may experience more extreme barriers on top of being a woman and a member of a marginalized racial minority group?
Absolutely. Vermont just did a specific report through the Justice Reinvestment 2 process that looks specifically at racial disparities. Vermont is no exception. Our systems are rooted in white supremacy. I run an anti-racism organization. We are not just allies. We are partners in the work of tearing down racism in the state of Vermont and nationally. Black women are actually at the top of the list for women who experience the absolute worst kinds of abuse, the largest kinds of barriers. The child welfare system targets Black and brown women more so than white women. The collateral damage that runs through Black and brown communities and families have been completely decimated by mass incarceration in Black and brown communities in this state and others. There's also this misconception in Vermont that it's those Black folks from that city coming here and selling drugs and ruining our pristine state. So allow me to clear up for folks. Hi, I am your friendly neighborhood drug dealer. I sold drugs all over this state. I also drove all over the East Coast to get them and bring them back here. And I also drove to those cities, walked a few different streets, found said maybe person of color, invited them back with me, housed them in my house, introduced them to my friends, and sold their drugs for them. So there are Black Vermonters here. It is statistically proven now in these reports, and we have some serious disparities that need to be addressed. So I do not and will not talk about the experience because I am not a Black woman and it is not my right to do so. But what I will tell you is that it is a much more horrific experience simply for the color of their skin than what I experienced.
Ashley, I hope you stay on long enough to read some of the comments in the chat, because there is a massive expression of gratitude that's currently happening in it for your comments and the what you have to say. And I think that at this point, it probably is best to wrap up. Do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make? Something that we didn't touch on? You don't feel like you have to? I actually do. I'm going to use a minute on this. How did you get from the bus stop when you had like 50,000 appointments you had to make and get a job? And how did that happen?
Well, so anybody that's been on FSU will tell you I didn't my first time. Was waiting for my parole hearing the first time around, went back to jail because I was too overwhelmed and I was using on the side. Luckily, Richard let me come back to Dismiss House the second time around. But the reality is sometimes it's literally luck. It's literally like by the grace of God or whatever you believe in, because I don't know that most of us that have been able to navigate FSU successfully actually know how we did it. Sometimes it's because, thank God, a friend or a family member was willing to give us a ride because we got to be at a risk reduction for 8. And then if we were lucky enough to find an employer that worked with us, it was just because that person gave us a ride between risk reduction and our job that we were able to keep it. Dismiss House, they'll let you miss a couple meals a week if you just talk to them. If you just go and say, hey, listen, I got to work late, or I got to go to therapy, and the only time I could do it is at this time because I got to work. Like, they're willing to work with you, and not all transitional houses are. That's another big difference about Dismiss. If you just talk to them and you're just honest, they'll work with you. You might not always like what they have to say. You might not always get like a yes, and that they'll like be like, sure, you can do whatever you want, but like, hey, that's life, right? So at least they'll keep it real with you most of the time.
That's life. We do try to keep it real. Thank you, Ashley. I can't begin to say what a great hour this has been. And again, if you want to learn more about Ashley and her organization, the website is WJFI, not to be confused with WIFI, which is Wi-Fi. So WJFI.org. And also, I think Jim is going to post in the chat room a link to our next speaker series event, which will be February 25th, also at noontime. And we are going to be joined by Dr. Erin Stewart, who is Chief of Psychology at Champlain Valley Physicians Hospital, which is part of the UVM Health Network. She is a specialist in, we will be looking at childhood trauma and how childhood trauma, particularly for women and girls, impacts the futures of people, and many people who are in incarcerated situations. She is a forensic psychologist. She specializes in the reduction of aggression and violence, limiting maladaptive behaviors in patients, trauma prevention, and intervention. So that registration, I see Jim has posted it. We hope to see you all again, and we thank you all for giving us this hour to learn together with us all. So long.
Very good.